All right, welcome back. We left off last time with the arrest of Stephen, with Stephen being arrested. And what comes next is a little bit tricky because we have the speech of Stephen. Now, to be honest, for HBO type television, if we were just to kind of go through Stephen's entire speech, we might lose people because it's sort of long. So again, the book of Acts is about 1/8 of the entire New Testament. And about 1/3 of the book of Acts is made up of speeches. Now, of all the speeches of Paul's and Peter's and everything else, this one coming up of Stephen's is the longest. So we're going to try and get at the content of the speech a little bit creatively without, boring our viewers. But it's worth it to back it up and read it yourself there in Acts 7. Okay, so we saw Stephen being arrested and treated rather roughly by the synagogue of freedmen, where he was arguing there in the temple courts, and all this stuff happens. So the next thing we do is we see Stephen in a bunch of flashback scenes. And remember, I casted him as kind of a hippie type, the kind who loves everybody, and you couldn't imagine saying a cruel word. Well, we just saw him being dragged away. So the flashback will be all these images of him doing some of the things that he was appointed to do by the disciples in the first place. Like maybe bringing food to widows and blessing people and praying for them. And scenes of him preaching in the temple. And even a scene or two of him healing people with disease who are brought to him. Because it says the Spirit empowered him to do many mighty things. And in this he looks bright and wonderful. And of course, the flashback we'll have to do creatively. Maybe it'll be sepia colored or something like that, and we'll have music playing in the background. Then we'll go back to the present. And now we see quite a different Stephen. Maybe bruised and roughed up by the police with a couple of cuts and everything else. But there he is, still having that sparkle in his eyes of brightness and goodness. And he's standing in that same hall that we've seen a couple of times now, where Peter and John were, then all the apostles were, that hall of hewn stone. He's before the Sanhedrin, some 70 men in all robes and official temple garments, and some temple police there, and there's even a handful of believers and some people who've been brought as witnesses against Stephen, those people from the synagogue of the freedmen and everything else. So it's a trial scene. And one of the witnesses is speaking, and we hear him saying, "I heard him with my own ears again and again. He said that Jesus of Nazareth came to destroy the temple, to take away our Jewishness, and undo what Moses taught us." And we cut to one or two believers in the back of the room, and one says to the other, "That's just not true. I heard those men outside. They were telling this witness what to say. That man speaking hasn't even heard Stephen." And then back to a wide view of the hall, and there's silence for a moment, and all eyes are on Stephen. And the camera cuts to his face, and it seems to be glowing. But now the high priest addresses him. "How do you respond to these charges?" And Stephen kind of smiles, looks around, and says, compassionately even, "Brothers, fathers, listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our father Abraham when he was far away from here, and spoke to him, 'Leave your country and go to the land I will show you.' And he came to this land, right here where you now live, but God did not give him any of it, not even a square foot of ground, but he promised he would give the land to his children." And then Stephen keeps speaking, but we cut to over in the side of the room, where there's a couple of temple police on the side there, and one sort of nudges a guard beside him and says under his breath, "Oh brother, all these religious types are the same." And the other guard whispers back, "What are you talking about?" And he says, "Well, ask a question about the temple." And instead of giving a simple answer, he has to retell our entire story of our people, starting with Abraham. Listen, he was just talking about Joseph, for crying out loud. And now he's telling the story of Egypt, Moses, and Sinai. Doesn't he think they know these stories already? It was a simple yes or no question, for goodness sakes. But the other guard says, "You don't get it at all. It's which stories he's telling and why he's telling them. What are they accusing him of? Speaking against the temple and the law." And then we'll insert another flashback scene. And this time it definitely has to be sepia. And we'll show, again, you see the temple courts and throngs of people there, and it's bustling, moving. It's high season and there's humans and animals there and booths everywhere. And then we see a disturbance happening over in a corner, and we see a man throwing over tables and shouting and general chaos around him erupting. And of course the scene we flash back to is when Jesus is overturning the temples. And we see some religious authorities run in to stop this man, and they restrain Jesus and push him back, and he shouts out loud, "This is to be called a house of prayer. You've made it into a den of thieves." And there's still chaos around. Money changers are picking up their goods and coins off the ground and resetting their tables. And the men, the religious authorities who stopped him, demand, "What authority gives you the right to do this? What sign are you going to show us to establish yourself?" And he says, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days." Cut back to another scene, still a flashback. Now, again, it's in that same hall, that hall of hewn stone we've seen so many times. But it's Jesus in that hall. And he's bound. And someone is shouting, "He said he would destroy the temple and raise it up in 3 days." And a younger Caiaphas says, "Is this true? What do you say to this?" But Jesus just looks at him. And Caiaphas shouts, "I charge you under oath by the living God, tell us, are you the Messiah?" And Jesus looks up and says, "You have said so. But I say to all of you, from now on you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming from the clouds of heaven." Coming on the clouds of heaven. And there's loud shouts and grumbles that break out, and Caiaphas tears his robe and shouts, "Do we need to hear any more?" And there's all kinds of shouts going through the Sanhedrin, "Put him to death." Now back to the present scene again. Stephen is still talking, but we pan back to those 2 guards on the side. And the second guard is still speaking. Each of these stories, look what he's saying. God met Abraham in Ur. God raised up Joseph in Egypt. God met Moses in Midian in a burning bush, and there he said, "Take off your sandals, you're on holy ground." Then God dwelt with his people in the tabernacle in the desert. Do you see what he's pointing out? God at work, but not at this temple. And what's this? And we pan back to Stephen speaking, and he says, "It was Solomon, we know, who finally built the temple. But the Most High does not live in houses made by human hands." And then back to the guards again. "Whoa, did you see that?" "What?" says the first guard. He's alluding to Isaiah and the prophets. When he says made with human hands, think idols. He's basically saying they've made an idol out of this temple. And the other guard says, "Well, I don't know all this religious stuff like you do, but I know this. He's playing a dangerous game. These aren't the people to get on the wrong side of." And right at that moment we cut back to Stephen, who's been talking in a gentle lilt, but now suddenly he looks around and he says, "Just like our people rejected all of these others, you stiff-necked people with hard, uncircumcised hearts and closed ears, you always resist the Holy Spirit. Was there ever a prophet your ancestors did not persecute? They even killed those who prophesied about the righteous one. Now that righteous one you have betrayed and murdered. You've received the law that's been commissioned by angels, but you don't even obey it." And the whole group starts shouting and yelling at Stephen. And then Stephen, in this weird oblivious, and this is where I get the image of him as kind of this hippie character, not aware or maybe not caring about the danger that he's in, looks up and like he's in another world just says, seeing something that no one else says, he says, "Look." And he points and he says, "I see heaven open and the Son of Man standing at the right hand of God." And the assembly literally charges at him. They're screaming and yelling, and they grab him. And so we're seeing 30 to 50 men, maybe more, just immediately grabbing him, rushing him out of that room, dragging him through the temple courts, the long way. They're shouting and moving through this entire area, and it's fast and it's violent. And the next thing you know, they're outside of the gates and they push Stephen and he's on the ground and they're still shouting, and these men start taking off their outer robes and they lay them at the feet of the man we saw before talking to Gamaliel, Saul. And meanwhile, Stephen stands up in the middle of the circle, and again he's beaten up, but he looks calm and peaceful. And then his body is hit by a rock, and then another one, and he lifts up his head and says, "Lord Jesus, receive my spirit." And another rock hits his body, knocking him to the ground. And he says, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." And another rock hits him, and he loses consciousness as more stones rain on him. And the scene ends with a view of Saul's face with this kind of venomous but smugly victorious stare. And that's it for this time. Lots of stuff going in there as the first martyr, Stephen, is killed. It's kind of interesting. There's a statement that Augustine gives much later on with Saul being there witnessing all these things, that we have the prayer of Stephen to thank for the Apostle Paul in most of our New Testament. The prayer of Stephen that said, "Lord, do not hold this sin against him." We have that prayer to thank for St. Paul and all the blessing that he gives to us in the New Testament. All right, see you next time.